Can I kiss you? The millionaire marries her in a contract one kiss breaks all rules. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The rain beat steadily against the floor-to-ceiling windows of a towering Manhattan skyscraper. Inside a private boardroom on the top floor, the air was sharp with silence. A long mahogany table stretched between them, polished to a shine, but empty except for a single folder placed at the center. Ella sat at one end, her coat damp from the storm, her fingers curled tightly in her lap. She had been summoned here without explanation, her chest pounding from the elevator ride up through glittering floors she had only ever seen in magazines. The man across from her leaned back in his leather chair, perfectly composed, his tailored suit catching the low golden light. Alexander Grant, tech mogul, young billionaire, a man whose name appeared on headlines and Forbes lists. To Ella, he looked untouchable, his expression unreadable as his dark eyes studied her like a chess piece. She had expected perhaps an interview, or some cruel mistake, but what he slid across the table made her breath stop. A contract. Pages of dense legal print. At the top, in bold, were the words, "Marriage Agreement." Her lips parted, a whisper breaking through the silence. This must be a joke. Alexander did not blink. It is not a joke. I am offering you a marriage contract. Sign it, and every debt your family faces will disappear. His voice was low, even, but carried the kind of authority that crushed doubt. Ella's throat went dry. She thought of her mother's unpaid hospital bills, the eviction notice taped to their door, the weight pressing her down day after day. She had spent nights calculating how many shifts as a waitress it would take to crawl out of that hole, and the number had always been impossible. Now, this man spoke as if it were nothing. "I do not understand," she whispered. "Why me?" He leaned forward slightly, his cufflinks catching the light. "Because you are unattached. Because you are desperate enough to consider this. And because you are not from my world. I need someone who will not threaten my empire, but who can stand at my side when appearances demand it." Ella shook her head, her pulse racing. "This is insane. Marriage is not supposed to be a business transaction." "Oh?" A flicker of something passed through his eyes, pain, perhaps, or bitterness, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Marriage is whatever two people agree it to be. This is a contract. Nothing more, nothing less. Her gaze fell to the folder again. Black ink, legal language, cold, binding words that could change everything. She imagined her mother's fragile hands clutching the unpaid bills, her younger brother's wide eyes when the landlord came knocking. Pride screamed for her to walk out, but desperation whispered louder. Alexander's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. 5 conditions. No love. Attend public events with me when required. Keep our arrangement confidential. Stay out of my personal business. And no intimacy unless it is required to convince others. His lips curved faintly, a smile without warmth. Simple. Do you accept? The storm outside raged louder, thunder echoing through the glass. Ella felt her chest tighten. She wanted to scream, to tell him no, to run back down to the streets where at least her choices were her own. But then her phone buzzed. A new message from the hospital. Urgent. Balance due immediately. Her vision blurred with tears she fought to hide. With trembling fingers, she reached for the pen beside the folder. The weight of it felt heavier than any object she had ever held. Slowly, she lowered the tip to the paper, her signature forming in unsteady strokes. When she set the pen down, she dared to look at him again. Alexander Grant studied her with those cold, sharp eyes. But something almost imperceptible shifted in his expression. Satisfaction, yes, but beneath it, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even regret. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Grant," he said quietly. Ella's heart hammered in her chest. She had signed away her freedom for survival. She told herself it was only a contract, just words on paper. But deep inside, she already knew nothing about this arrangement would be simple. And one day soon, A single kiss would shatter every rule written on that page. The rain did not let up that night. It followed Ella all the way back to her apartment, soaking through the thin fabric of her coat, chilling her to the bone. She trudged up the cracked concrete steps of the old building, water dripping from her hair as she pushed open the door. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew and old paint, the single light bulb overhead flickering weakly. Inside her room, the ceiling leaked in one corner, a pan placed beneath to catch the steady drip. The walls were bare except for a faded calendar, months out of date. She sat heavily on the edge of her bed, a mattress worn thin from years of use. Her backpack lay slumped against the wall, a stack of unpaid bills spilling from the zipper. Ella stared at them for a long moment. Hospital invoices in red ink, utility warnings stamped in bold letters, and at the top, the eviction notice, dated for the end of the week. Her chest tightened until it hurt. Her phone buzzed again, lighting up with a reminder from the hospital. Final balance required for continued care. She pressed her palms over her face, trying to block out the words. Her mother had been sick for months, growing weaker by the day. Every visit to the sterile hospital room left Ella with a heavier weight. She had promised to take care of her, promised to keep a roof over their heads. But promises did not pay doctors. A soft knock at the door made her jump. Her younger brother, Daniel, peeked his head inside. His hair stuck up in messy tufts, his backpack hanging from one shoulder. "Ella, the landlord came by again. He said if we do not have the money, we are out by Friday." She forced a smile for him, though her throat burned. "Do not worry about it, Danny. I will figure something out." "No." He stepped inside, dropping his bag to the floor. "You always say that, but you are working double shifts and skipping meals. You cannot keep this up." His voice cracked, and the boy who had once been carefree now sounded older than his years. Ella wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight against her chest. "I am doing this for us. For Mom. I will not let them take our home. I promise." "Oh." But as Daniel pulled away and went to his corner of the small room, Ella's gaze fell back on the bills. The contract she had signed hours earlier echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. A marriage in name only. No love, no intimacy, just survival. She shivered, though the air inside was still. What kind of life had she agreed to? Standing beside a man like Alexander Grant, cold and untouchable, pretending to be something she was not. It felt like selling her soul. But what choice had she truly had? The following morning, she dragged herself out of bed before dawn. Her shift at the diner started at 6, and she needed the money. The streets were slick with rain, her shoes squishing with every step. She kept her head down, trying to avoid the curious stares of people who seemed to move effortlessly through a city that had never once opened its doors to her. At the diner, the smell of burnt coffee and fried bacon clung to the air. Ella tied her apron around her waist and pushed through the morning rush. Orders shouted, plates clattered, and customers tapped their fingers impatiently. She moved quickly, balancing trays and pouring coffee, her smile fixed even as her body ached. When her shift ended, she returned home with just enough tips to cover groceries for the week. She stopped at the small corner market, picking up bread, milk, and a few apples. Every coin mattered, and she counted each one twice before handing them over. Back at the apartment, she set the groceries on the counter and let out a long breath. Daniel sat at the table, hunched over his homework, the sound of his pencil scratching against the paper. Their mother's weak cough drifted from the bedroom down the hall. Ella pressed a hand against her chest. This was her life, a life of scraping by, of patching holes in walls and hiding fear behind tired smiles. Yet tonight, as she lay awake listening to the rain drip into the pan, she could not shake the image of Alexander Grant across that boardroom table. His cold voice, his sharp eyes, the way he had said, "Welcome to your new life." She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. For in the quiet dark, Ella knew her old life was already gone. The contract had tied her fate to his, and soon, her world would collide with his world of wealth, power, and secrets. And when it did, no amount of secondhand dresses or worn shoes could prepare her for what awaited. The morning of the contract signing replayed in Ella's mind again and again, like a scene she could not escape. Days passed in a blur of exhaustion. She continued to wait tables at the diner, continued to stretch every dollar to cover her family's needs, but the weight of what she had agreed to pressed down harder with each passing hour. Then, just 3 days after the stormy night in the boardroom, a sleek black car pulled up in front of her crumbling apartment building. The engine purred like a predator at rest. Neighbors peeked through cracked curtains as the driver stepped out in a dark suit and opened the back door. "Miss Ella Brooks?" he asked, his voice steady, formal. She hesitated on the sidewalk, her grocery bag cutting into her palm. "Yes, that is me. The car is waiting. Mr. Grant requested your presence at his residence. Tonight." Her throat went dry. She nodded slowly, setting the bag down with shaking hands. Moments later, she found herself inside the leather-scented interior, the city's worn streets blurring past the tinted glass. The car climbed toward the gated edge of Manhattan where wealth gleamed in steel and glass. When the gates opened, Ella's breath caught. The mansion before her looked more like a museum than a home. Towering columns rose toward the night sky, marble steps glistened with rain, and a line of windows glowed gold against the darkness. Inside, the air was cool and silent. A grand chandelier spilled light across polished stone floors. Every piece of furniture looked untouched, as if waiting for a guest that never came. The driver guided her into a long dining hall where a table stretched farther than her eyes could follow. At the far end sat Alexander Grant, already in a tailored suit, his posture impossibly straight. "Sit," he said simply, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Ella obeyed, lowering herself onto the velvet cushion. The place setting in front of her shimmered silver cutlery, crystal glassware, porcelain plates rimmed in gold. She had never eaten from anything so fine in her life, and her hands shook as she touched the edge of the napkin. Alexander studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without preamble, he slid another folder across the table. "The final contract. You will review the conditions once more. If you are still willing, the arrangement begins tonight." She swallowed hard, her voice nearly breaking. "You already have my signature." He leaned forward slightly. "A signature is ink, but tonight you step into my world. That is the true beginning." Her fingers traced the cover of the folder. The words blurred before her eyes, but she already remembered each condition by heart. No love. Public appearances. Confidentiality. No interference. No intimacy unless absolutely necessary. Cold, sharp rules written to protect his empire. "Still," she whispered, "I accept." Alexander's gaze softened, just for a fraction of a second. Then he stood, moving around the table with quiet steps. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He placed a small velvet box on the table in front of her. "Open it," he said. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a diamond ring, brilliant and flawless, the kind of stone she had only ever seen in magazines displayed on women nothing like her. The sight made her chest tighten. "This is the symbol," he continued. "The world will believe it. They must. From this moment on, you are my wife. Do you understand?" Ella's lips parted, but no sound came. Slowly, she nodded. Alexander lifted the ring, and without asking, slid it onto her finger. The weight of it felt unnatural, heavy with meaning that did not belong to her. She wanted to pull her hand back, to reject it, but she stayed still. Survival required silence. As the metal settled against her skin, he leaned close, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Do not mistake this for romance. This is an arrangement, nothing more." But in that moment, Ella caught something in his eyes, a flicker of loneliness, a shadow of pain that cracked through his perfect mask. Dinner passed in silence, interrupted only by the quiet clink of silver against porcelain. Ella barely tasted the food. Her thoughts tangled, her heart racing with fear and questions she could not voice. When the plates were cleared, Alexander rose, his face composed once more. "From tonight, you live here. A suite has been prepared for you upstairs. Follow the housekeeper. She will show you the rules of this home." Ella stood shakily, her legs unsteady beneath her. She followed the housekeeper through endless hallways lined with portraits and priceless art. The suite she entered was larger than her entire apartment. Velvet curtains framed the tall windows, the bed draped in silk sheets, the air carrying the faint scent of roses. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Alone in the vast silence, Ella pressed her hand to her chest. The diamond ring glinted under the chandelier light. She whispered to herself, "What have I done?" Outside, the storm had ended, but inside her, a new one had only just begun. Ella did not sleep much her first night inside the mansion. The silence was unnerving, too different from the usual hum of traffic and dripping pipes in her small apartment. Here, every corner gleamed, every curtain fell heavy with wealth. Yet she felt like an intruder who did not belong. She lay awake, staring at the chandelier above the bed until dawn broke pale and cold across the tall windows. When morning came, the housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, arrived with a clipboard in hand. Her voice was polite, but clipped, every word measured. "Miss Brooks, pardon, Mrs. Grant, you will need to review the schedule for today. There are fittings, etiquette lessons, and a formal dinner this evening. Mr. Grant expects you to present yourself accordingly." "Oh." Ella nodded silently, though her stomach tightened. She had signed away her life only days ago, and already the transformation had begun. The fittings came first. A team of stylists swarmed her suite, rolling in racks of gowns and shoes she could not even name. They pinned fabric against her body, clipped her hair, and painted her face until the reflection in the mirror no longer looked like the girl from the diner. She saw someone else, someone polished, someone meant for a stage she never asked to stand on. "Posture," one stylist reminded, tilting Ella's chin higher. "Smile softer. Walk as if the ground belongs to you." Her cheeks flushed, but she obeyed. The weight of their scrutiny pressed heavily on her shoulders. Next came etiquette lessons. She was seated at a long table in a quiet room, across from a tutor who placed 12 pieces of silverware neatly in front of her. "You must remember each one," the tutor instructed. "Every fork has its purpose, every glass its place. In Alexander Grant's world, every mistake is magnified." Ella tried to follow, but her hands shook. She dropped a fork, the clatter echoing across the marble. The tutor sighed, disappointed. "You cannot afford errors like that in public." By late afternoon, her head ached from information, her body sore from standing, her nerves frayed. She longed for the smell of cheap coffee, for the comfort of her mother's faint smile, for Daniel's jokes that masked his own fear. Instead, she was trapped in a palace where every corner whispered that she did not belong. As evening fell, she was led to the grand foyer, where Alexander waited in a dark suit. He looked at her briefly, his gaze lingering on the gown chosen for her. His expression did not soften, but his silence said enough. She caught the flicker of approval before his mask returned. "Tonight," he said simply, "you will attend a private dinner with business partners. You will speak only when spoken to. Do you understand?" Ella's throat tightened, but she nodded. The car ride was quiet, the city lights flashing like distant stars beyond the tinted glass. When they arrived at a glittering restaurant, paparazzi already clustered outside. Flashes erupted as Alexander stepped out first, extending a hand for her. Cameras caught every movement. She hesitated only a second before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm, grounding her, though his eyes never met hers. Inside, the dinner was a blur of laughter, clinking glasses, and conversations filled with jargon she did not understand. Executives in tailored suits spoke of mergers and profits, their eyes occasionally flicking toward Ella with polite curiosity. She sat quietly, following the rules, but her heart raced with every question directed at her. "So, Mrs. Grant," one woman asked with a smile too sharp to be kind, "how did you and Alexander meet?" Ella froze. The air seemed to thicken. Alexander's gaze turned to her, his expression unreadable. She forced a smile, the lie tasting bitter. "At a charity gala. It was unexpected." The woman arched a brow, but said nothing more. Conversation resumed, but Ella's pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted the night to end, wanted to retreat into the shadows where no one would see her. When the dinner finally concluded, Alexander guided her back to the car. Neither spoke until the city lights faded behind them. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "You handled yourself adequately." Adequately. The word stung, yet carried the faintest trace of reluctant praise. Ella turned to the window, hiding the mix of frustration and relief on her face. Back at the mansion, she slipped out of her heels and into the quiet of her suite. The gown pooled at her feet, the diamond ring glinting under the light. She stood barefoot, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The girl looking back was draped in silk, but her eyes revealed the truth. She was still the waitress who had signed a contract in desperation. She whispered softly to her reflection, "How long can I keep this up?" Outside, the city roared with life. But inside the mansion, Ella felt caged by silence. And somewhere down the hall, Alexander Grant sat alone in his study, staring at a contract that bound them both, wondering why the image of her trembling hands lingered in his mind. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Ella never could have imagined. Each morning, Mrs. Whitmore delivered a schedule as precise as a court order. Breakfast at 8, lessons in etiquette or business culture at 10, fittings at noon, charity rehearsals in the afternoon. The mansion was alive with staff, yet hollow at its core. They all moved with practiced silence, treating her with stiff politeness but never warmth. Alexander remained distant. He was often gone before dawn and returned late at night, his presence felt only in brief glimpses. Sometimes she would hear his voice echoing down the marble halls as he spoke firmly into his phone, commanding entire industries with a tone that brooked no argument. Other times, she caught sight of him through the half-open door of his study, his head bowed over endless contracts and ledgers, the glow of his desk lamp casting sharp shadows across his features. But there was no real conversation between them. At meals, words were sparse, limited to the clink of silverware and the occasional question about whether she remembered the rules. Every moment reinforced what he had told her. This was an arrangement, not a marriage. One evening, a notice arrived for an upcoming gala. It would be their first large-scale appearance as husband and wife. The invitation bore the seal of the city's cultural foundation, a night where senators, celebrities, and executives mingled under the same roof. For Alexander, it was routine. For Ella, it was a storm waiting to break. The night of the gala, stylists worked on her for hours. A black gown was draped across her shoulders, elegant and severe, the kind of dress that demanded attention. Her hair was swept up, diamonds borrowed from Alexander's collection fastened around her neck. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Alexander appeared in the doorway in a dark tuxedo. His gaze lingered a fraction longer than usual before he spoke. "You look the part." She swallowed, uncertain how to respond. "I will try not to embarrass you." His expression did not change, but his voice lowered just slightly. "Do not think of them. Just remember what we agreed. Stand tall, smile when necessary. And if anyone asks too many questions—" He paused, his eyes catching hers. "I will handle it." Oh, at the gala, chandeliers blazed overhead, and the hum of conversation rolled through the grand hall. Cameras flashed as they stepped from the limousine, his hand resting lightly at her back. Reporters shouted questions, but Alexander guided her forward without pause, his presence commanding the crowd like a tide. Inside, she clung to every lesson drilled into her. The right fork, the correct glass, the polite laugh at a comment she barely understood. She was doing well until the questions began. A woman in a sequined gown leaned across the table, her eyes sharp. "Mrs. Grant, you must tell us. What drew you to Alexander? His fortune, his power, or his charm?" The table chuckled. Ella froze. The words clawed at her, each one a blade aimed at her dignity. She glanced at Alexander, but his face was unreadable. She drew a shaky breath and answered, "None of those things. What drew me to him was the way he carries the weight of responsibility. It is not easy to stand alone at the top, but he does. That kind of strength, it inspires people." The laughter died away. A hush rippled across the table. For the first time, Ella saw surprise flicker in Alexander's eyes. The conversation moved on, but the moment lingered. Later, as they left the ballroom, the cold night air rushed against her skin. Ella wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. Alexander stopped, his gaze steady on her. "You should not have had to answer that question," he said quietly. She forced a smile. "It is all right. I just told the truth." For a brief second, the mask slipped. His eyes softened, his jaw unclenched. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Ella." He hesitated, as if fighting an invisible battle within himself. Then the words came, almost reluctant, almost a plea. "Can I kiss you?" Her heart stopped. The world seemed to fall silent around them, the city lights blurring into nothing. Every rule of the contract flashed through her mind, no intimacy, no blurred lines. But here he stood, not the billionaire commanding boardrooms, but a man asking, vulnerable, uncertain. Her lips parted, breath shallow. She whispered, "If you do, everything changes." His hand brushed against hers, warm, steady. Maybe it should. And in that fragile moment, the contract that bound them felt like paper ready to burn. The words hung between them in the cold night air, suspended like fragile glass. Ella's heart thundered in her chest, louder than the traffic rushing by on the street below. Alexander's eyes searched hers, sharp as ever, but now carrying something she had never seen before: hesitation. For a man who commanded boardrooms and crushed negotiations with a single glance, he suddenly looked almost uncertain. She felt her breath catch. The contract's rules screamed in her mind. No intimacy unless necessary. No blurred lines. But standing there, in the glow of the city lights, Alexander Grant was not the billionaire she had signed her life away to. He was simply a man, alone, asking for permission to cross a line he had drawn himself. Ella whispered, her voice trembling, "If you kiss me, there will be no going back." For a moment, she thought he might step closer, erase the distance between them, but then his jaw tightened. He withdrew his hand and slipped back into the armor he always wore. His tone hardened again. "We should go. The car is waiting." The spell broke. Back at the mansion, silence stretched between them. Ella retreated to her suite, slipping out of the gown and jewels, standing barefoot in front of the mirror. She stared at her reflection, the girl who had been kissed by words but not by lips. A girl trapped between contract and desire. She touched the diamond ring on her finger, its weight heavier than ever before. Days passed, but the moment lingered. Alexander became even more distant, burying himself in work. He left before dawn, returned long after midnight, his study glowing with lamplight as he drafted new contracts and struck new deals. Ella began to wonder if she had imagined that flicker of vulnerability in him, if perhaps the question had been nothing but a fleeting weakness he now regretted. But she could not forget it. One evening, she wandered through the vast halls of the mansion, restless. Her footsteps echoed against marble floors, until she found herself at the door of his study. It was ajar, light spilling through the crack. She hesitated, then gently pushed it open. Alexander sat at his desk, tie loosened, hands gripping his temples as though fighting off a headache. Papers were scattered in front of him, numbers and charts swimming across the page. He looked up sharply when he realized she was there. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice low but guarded. Ella stepped inside. "I just wanted to see if you were all right." His eyes narrowed slightly. "I do not need concern. I need efficiency. That is why this contract exists." She crossed her arms, forcing herself not to flinch under his words. "You signed a contract with me, Alexander. But I am still a person. You cannot expect me to exist in this house like a ghost." For the first time, frustration cracked through his calm. He rose from his chair, pacing to the window. "You think this is easy for me? Bringing someone into this life, into this house, into a world where every move is watched, every smile dissected. You do not know what it is like to live under a microscope." Ella's chest tightened. She stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Then why ask me to be here at all?" He turned, and for a moment, his mask dropped. "Because I am tired of being alone." The confession hit her like a wave. For all his power, all his wealth, Alexander Grant was a man haunted by solitude. The silence stretched, heavy, electric. Ella whispered, "You do not have to be." Something shifted in his eyes again, that same spark she had seen outside the gala. He took one step toward her, then another, until he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. His voice was low, almost pleading. "Ella!" Her pulse quickened. She could smell the faint scent of his cologne, see the tension etched into his features. Her hand lifted almost without thought, brushing lightly against his sleeve. But before the moment could break, the sharp buzz of his phone shattered the air. Alexander froze, jaw clenched, and turned back to his desk. "I have to take this." Ella stepped back, her chest aching. She nodded quietly, retreating from the study. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but the echo of his words followed her down the hall. Because I am tired of being alone. That night, lying awake in her suite, Ella stared at the ceiling. She had entered this arrangement to save her family, to survive. But now, something else was unfolding. Something neither contract nor rules could control. And deep down, she knew one day soon, Alexander Grant would have to choose between the safety of his walls and the truth of his heart. The fragile balance did not last long. A week after the gala, whispers began to ripple through the media. Tabloids published blurry photos of Ella stepping out of the black car, headlines dripping with malice. Who is she? The unknown girl who snared a billionaire. Other articles were sharper, accusing her of being a gold digger, suggesting the marriage was a scheme. Ella sat at the breakfast table one morning. The paper spread in front of her. Her hands trembled as she read the words. Her face stared back at her in grainy print, painted as a liar, a woman who had conned her way into Alexander's empire. Shame burned hot in her chest. Alexander entered moments later, his expression stormy. He snatched the paper from her hands and tossed it aside. "Ignore it," he said curtly. "Ignore it?" she repeated, her voice breaking. "They are calling me a thief, a fraud. They are tearing me apart, Alexander. And you—" She stopped, her throat tight. "You do not deny it." "Oh." His jaw clenched. Denying it would only feed the fire. Tears stung her eyes. "So you will let the world believe I married you for money?" The silence stretched like a blade. "Finally," he said coldly, "this is exactly why we had rules. To prevent feelings, to prevent weakness. You knew what this was." The words cut deeper than she expected. Ella pushed back her chair, her voice shaking. "You made me sign that contract. You pulled me into this life. And now when the world points at me, you hide behind your walls. Do you know how that feels?" For the first time, Alexander looked away. His silence was an answer sharper than words. Ella grabbed her coat and stormed out of the mansion, her steps echoing across the marble like thunder. The driver called after her, but she kept walking, the cold wind biting her cheeks. She did not know where she was going, only that she needed to breathe somewhere beyond those gilded walls. She found herself back in the old neighborhood, the diner where she used to work glowing faintly in the evening. Through the window, she saw familiar faces, people who had known her before diamonds and contracts. For a moment, she pressed her forehead against the glass, longing for the simplicity she had lost. But even here, whispers followed. Two women at the counter glanced her way, one leaning in to mutter, "That is her, the one who married him. Everyone knows it is fake." Ella's stomach twisted. She turned away, pulling her coat tighter. Back at the mansion, Alexander stood in his study, staring at the headlines spread across his desk. His cousin, an ambitious man long circling the empire, had fueled the rumors, feeding journalists pieces of truth twisted into poison. Alexander's fists clenched as he realized the intent. It was not just Ella they were after. It was his legacy, his control, everything he had built. And now, the woman bound to him by contract was caught in the crossfire. For the first time, Alexander wondered if he had made the gravest mistake of all, believing that he could keep his heart out of this arrangement. The storm broke inside the boardroom. Days after the tabloids exploded, Alexander walked into a meeting with his board of directors. Every seat around the long polished table was filled with sharp suits and sharper eyes. Documents had been distributed, photographs clipped to pages, headlines circled in red ink. The words were clear: sham marriage, scandal, threat to the company's reputation. His cousin, Victor, rose smoothly from his chair, his voice calm but poisonous. "Alexander, your judgment has failed. You married a woman with no background, no pedigree, no ties to our world. The press is feasting on it. Shareholders are nervous. If you care about this company, annul the marriage. Remove her before she ruins everything you built." The board murmured in agreement, some nodding, others whispering. Alexander's jaw clenched as he scanned the table. For a moment, his silence gave weight to their accusations. Then he stood. His voice cut through the room like thunder. This company was not built on appearances. It was built on innovation, on leadership, on my decisions. And my decision is final. Ella is my wife. Victor's smile sharpened. "Your wife?" "Everyone knows it is a contract, Alexander. You dragged a poor girl from nowhere and dressed her up to fit your world. That is not a marriage. That is a performance." Alexander's eyes blazed. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out the very contract that had started it all, and with deliberate calm, he tore it down the center. The paper ripped loudly, echoing off the marble walls. He let the pieces fall across the table. "There is no contract anymore," he said, his voice steady. "No performance, no arrangement. From this day, it is not business. It is not obligation. It is my choice, my heart." The room fell into stunned silence. Even Victor faltered, his composure cracking. Outside those doors, Ella stood frozen in the hallway. She had come to return her ring, to end the charade herself. But she had heard everything, the rip of the contract. Alexander's words spoken with a conviction she never believed she would hear. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her chest. Tears blurred her vision, but they were not of shame this time. They were something else, entirely. When Alexander emerged from the boardroom, his tie loosened and his shoulders tense, he stopped cold at the sight of her. Their eyes met, and for once, no words were needed. He had risked his empire, his name, his legacy. For her? Slowly, Alexander stepped closer, pulling from his pocket a velvet box, not with the cold diamond of their first deal, but with a new ring. Simpler, honest. His voice, steady but raw, carried through the quiet corridor. "Ella, I do not want contracts. I do not want conditions. I want you, only you. Will you give me a chance, not as my obligation, but as my wife?" The world around them fell away. Ella's lips trembled as she whispered, "Yes." And for the first time, the arrangement that had begun in desperation blossomed into something real love, that no boardroom, no scandal, no contract could ever erase. The weeks after the boardroom confrontation changed everything. The scandal that had once filled tabloids began to fade. Stories shifted from rumors of fraud to images of a couple standing together, unshaken. At charity events, Ella no longer stood silent at Alexander's side. She spoke with conviction, her warmth disarming the coldest rooms. People began to see her not as a stranger who slipped into wealth, but as a woman with a voice and dignity of her own. Alexander changed too. The walls he had built around himself slowly crumbled. He no longer vanished into his study for endless nights. No longer spoke to her in clipped commands. Instead, he listened. Sometimes he would find her in the kitchen, laughing softly as she cooked something simple, and he would sit just to watch. Other times, they would walk the gardens at dusk, hand in hand, speaking of dreams instead of duties. The mansion, once a cage, became a home. On a quiet evening, Alexander led her back to the gallery wing, where he had prepared something in secret. Canvases lined the walls, sketches and paintings Ella had hidden away in her sketchbook, works she never thought anyone would see. He had gathered them, framed them, and turned the space into her own exhibition. She pressed her hands to her mouth, eyes filling with tears. "You did this? For me?" He smiled softly. "It was always more than a contract, Ella. I just needed to find the courage to admit it." She turned to him, her voice breaking. "So where does this story end?" Alexander dropped to one knee, pulling out the simple ring he had shown her in the corridor weeks before. "It does not end. It begins again. Ella Brooks Grant, will you marry me? Truly this time? Not for rules or appearances, but for love?" Her tears fell freely as she whispered, "Yes." The gallery lights shimmered around them, casting golden halos across her art. As Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, he leaned close and kissed her, not as part of an arrangement, not as a question, but as an answer. And for Ella, who had once believed she had sold her soul to survive, it was proof that even the coldest contracts could be torn apart by one undeniable truth: love that chooses, love that endures, love that breaks every rule.